that a no-deal Brexit is a terrible scenario for communities, for businesses, particularly for Ireland, the island of Ireland, but also for us, because I think we can't predict just how chaotic that could be. And if you combine the triple whammy of climate change and its implications, Brexit, a no-deal Brexit, and COVID, and the recession which COVID appears to be bringing, we really could end up bringing a lot of bricks down on top of our own heads, because obviously climate change and COVID, there are elements of that which we can't control or which are very difficult to control. Whereas with a negotiation, I feel our government could be trying much harder to get a good deal, and also to reassure communities and businesses that they have a grip, when they seem to be using this once again as a sort of ideological plaything. And the recent internal market bill, which we're at committee stage on, is a really good example of where this could easily be put to bed. They didn't need to bring this out now. They could have used the joint committee arrangements to resolve any outstanding issues, and instead, without even warning the EU through back channels, they just produced this bill 10 days ago. And this is the sort of government that we're dealing with, very unpredictable, very ideologically driven, and with Brexit being the only real issue that brings them together as a party.
And that, of course, has been the way the whole way through since 2016. A lot of this is about keeping the Conservative Party together rather than creating good outcomes for the country, which is very, very sad to watch, of course. I mean, with the Internal Market Bill, what do you think their intention was? Do you think it's a negotiating manoeuvre, or do you think it's an admission from them that they think no deal is going to happen, and this is them drawing a boundary for the future in case there is no deal, for that eventuality?
I think the negotiations got to a point where there were two remaining issues: fisheries or fishing, and the rules around subsidies to businesses, the equal playing field. And personally, I think those two issues are resolvable. So you can get a resolution on both those things. So I think Mr. Gove said, how can we push to make this a bit easier for ourselves? And they billed it as tying up a few loose ends. But both the trade union movement and the Labour Party are very worried about this bill, because not only does it ask MPs to break international law by passing it through our parliament, but secondly, it does seek to provide that backdrop of the most extreme version of Brexit, where the UK just breaks away from standards, from workers' rights, potentially from environmental standards, so that it's playing very much to the civil libertarian and free trade side of the Tory party, but without the rights and responsibilities which would go with a good negotiation, but which would also go with our partners who have been our partners in all geopolitical senses since the end of the Second World War.
And you've been speaking to colleagues from the European Union side. What is their view at this point? I mean, are they still hopeful that a deal might happen, or are they thinking this is dead in the water now and just preparing for no deal?
Well, publicly, people will always say, that we need to keep working on this deal. And I actually think we should keep working, because a deal is still better than no deal. But increasingly, that particular deal is looking like a very hard Brexit indeed. And that's very disappointing, because the vote was so narrow in 2016. And also we know that a number of people who voted for Brexit have said, we really only want Brexit if there is a decent deal with the European Union. And that's looking increasingly unlikely. And just in general with the negotiation, you do often get to a point, don't you, where people are just sick of each other. And it does feel as though one side or the other may well walk. And to me, that is being reckless. And this government has shown itself to be reckless, and this party, the Tory party, is showing itself to be reckless in the way that it's carrying out this negotiation, with no thought for, the peace deal in Northern Ireland, with no thought for our dairy industry, with no thought for many of our food manufacturers, and importantly, our communities. because if you speak to people who live in Newry or who live in Armagh, they just can't believe that the government isn't, speeding up the procedures that need to be undertaken in order to make this thing work. And it's just a couple of months away. And of course, then there are much wider questions, which I think we'll get to later, about the university sector, science and technology. And once again, just this feeling that we are in a bare knuckle descent towards just things getting worse. And that's really deeply depressing as an MP.
It is. I mean, it's deeply depressing as a Labour Party member and as somebody who speaks to MPs and who's watching all of this happen. Which brings me to my next question, really. So, as we approach the end of the transition period, which is, of course, when the vast majority of things changed, hardly anything at all changed really at the end of January. What are your biggest fears for our country moving forward? I mean, is it Northern Ireland? Is it the university sector? Is it citizens' rights?
Well, I think it's the sort of combination of all those things, because the freedom of movement issue, part of the magic of that was to integrate us sort of as a geopolitical entity. So as we know, in sort of geopolitical terms, there's China, there's the US, and then there's Europe, one of the biggest markets in the world, over 500 million people. And we were very comfortable in that. And in my view, I know that there were some issues that needed to be resolved, the refugee crisis for one. And I just feel as though by walking away, we're taking away our leadership role within our region. And also it's a very uncertain future, because a US trade deal is looking like it's going to be more difficult to get, because this government has complicated the Irish question around the protocol and around this new internal market bill. But also, you see, with any trade deal, you have to talk about human rights, you have to talk about national security, you have to have an assessment of what that trade deal is going to encompass, and whether indeed you want to have a trade deal with some, for example, with China at the moment, the worries around the Uyghur minority and the way they're being treated, the worries around Tibet, the worries around Hong Kong. It's not as easy as the government is making out, that trade deals can just be done overnight. And so I'm worried, not only are we leaving, such a big market and in not good terms, that it's not as though there's a straightforward way of just doing business with third parties, and I'm very, very worried about which direction the UK is going to go in.
Yeah, I think the government believe we can sort of hang around in the middle between China and the US and Europe and play off everybody against each other, but I don't think that's going to be borne out. And the danger, of course, is that we get lost, not just economically, but also in other terms as well. And most dangerously, is, of course, in terms of security. So we will have to hope that doesn't happen. And I think we're also going to have to hope that our friends stay friends, if you see what I mean. As in, you hope that Europe stays friendly towards us in terms of security and defence and police cooperation and things like that. And indeed, in terms of standing up against Russia and China and other countries and superpowers that are of questionable intent, if you like. Otherwise, I think we could be in serious trouble. And the most worrying thing, of course, is that we don't know what's going to happen over the next 4 years or over the next 10 years until we can get a more reasonable relationship with Europe again. And my next question is, following on from that, there are so many implications to Brexit, but I always feel that the public understands very little. Of course, I think they do understand the trade implications and the potential implications for food prices and supply chains and things like that to an extent, because that's been the dominant conversation over the last few years. But I think there's much less understanding of the defence implications of policing and sharing data and universities and lots of freedom of movement and what that means for us. And what more do you think that we can be doing, as a party and as party members, to educate the public about the changes that are coming and why they matter?
Yeah. I think one approach would be almost to turn that around and talk in the Labour movement about what vision do we have for a good relationship with Europe going forward. So, what are the things that we really want to keep hold of? And a lot of that is around the people to people, the fact that we are geographically so close, those concerns around safety, which you've talked about, a safe region, concerns around, we share so much in the way that we see the world, with human rights concerns being very high up our agenda. We want to see the research environment continue to be positive for life sciences, which is so important for medical work, medical research. A lot of the research around cancer has been done through collaborations with European scientific institutions, and a lot of the funding that comes through Europe has helped our regions, so regional growth. If we want to talk about levelling up, then look at how much Cornwall or some other regions have had in terms of European funding. And what has that brought? Improvements in the environment, improvements in, our, propping up our agricultural sector. I mean, we haven't yet sort of quite gripped that, but it is starting, that the National Farmers Union is starting to say, if we want to maintain a good environment and a lot of the gains that we've made through our membership of the European Union, then what we want to see is that maintained. So I think in a way what we need to do is, rather than necessarily, we have to be negative in Parliament because we have to point out the facts, it has to be on the record, but I think we could do some more work within our CLPs about what does a future good relationship with Europe look like, because eventually this negotiation will be behind us. And I know from speaking with ambassadors and speaking with others that there is still a very strong connection there, and we need to think about what it is that we want to see. I wonder, ironically, if we're going to go back to twin towns, which was always sort of my background in local government. You see, once the EU was well established, some of that sort of receded because the integration was there. And I think decision makers felt, look, we're integrated now, we don't need to do these jollies where we meet each other. But I just wonder whether we will want to connect with people more. The other thing is, of course, that culturally, I think we will feel a change, because I think there are 3.8 million EU nationals who have registered now for the scheme. And many of those people, of course, have been living in the UK for 50 years. They just didn't get around to getting a British passport. But I think we will notice in our workforce that we won't have quick access to people who are already trained into roles like nursing, like being doctors, teachers. And I think we're going to feel that. So I think culturally, we're going to find it very difficult to bring up that sense of the diversity within the workplace, that sense of a quick person who can fix a problem in the workplace. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for us economically, but I think we're also going to miss that sense of who's this new person, how, getting to know new people, and that we will miss that.
I think we will, and I think we will have to hope that it comes back. But I think you're quite right. I think we do want to find ways to create those links, whether that's twin towns, or I don't know whether it's twinning a CLP with a equivalent in Germany or something like that. I mean, that might be something that
Yes.
we could do, assuming that they have such an equivalent. I presume that they do. And which brings me to my next question, really, which is politically, obviously, Brexit has been toxic, really, for a long time. And I think certainly by the 2019 election, a lot of people in the population of the public had really just got bored of Parliament refusing to come to an agreement, and the kind of constant daily news stories, which on the one hand all sound the same, and on the other hand, telling people different things. And I think there is a sense just of kind of fatigue, which I think is one reason why we've got to this point where we're walking into an incredibly hard Brexit that would have been unthinkable even a couple of years ago. But however, over the next 4 years, Labour has to walk the line between primarily and first and foremost needing to win the next general election, but also needing to rehabilitate the idea of Europe and the subject of Europe, and needing to have a comprehensive answer to what's Labour's policy on Europe then? What's your thinking on how Labour should handle that over the next 4 years, both in terms of content and in terms of speed? When is the right time to start talking about future European engagement? Is it now? Is it 6 months from now? Is it 2 years from now? Does more time need to pass? What's your thinking on that?
I mean, my feeling is that, as ever with politics, events will overtake us. So just taking coronavirus, for example, there's so much we can learn from the European approach. For example, Italy, which was just in advance of us before the coronavirus outbreak here, where I think our medics learnt a lot from watching their treatment options and so on, but also watching the health system be rather overwhelmed there. They've really got moving on test and trace, and their tracing systems are very robust. Whereas, so it's something we can learn from. And the COVID, you know, we can see good and bad examples of best practice, but that's the sort of thing where, you know, regardless of what it is, we will have European partners who will be with us on that journey. And then in terms of the wider threats, obviously, who knows what's going to happen eventually between the US and China, whether this sort of Cold War, trade war becomes a hot war. And therefore, you know, we will obviously have an interest in that. The impact of starting to talk to China about a trade deal, that's very concerning, because obviously with the might of the European Union, they have managed to integrate discussions about human rights, discussions about security, together with maintaining a reasonable trade relationship with China. Okay, there's not a deal there per se, but there's, you know, a good conversation starting there. And yet I feel it could be quite a hard landing for us, because most people feel very angry in the country about, say, the Uyghur minority or Hong Kong. And I support the work that the government has done on Hong Kong in terms of, you know, being very open about accepting Hong Kong refugees should that become necessary. But then I think we do need to explain to people that our economy is quite integrated with China. The Chinese companies have an awful lot of contracted work that they're doing in the UK. So we need to explain that whereas Huawei was, of course, one example of that, there are numerous other examples in terms of the infrastructure coming down the line. So at the moment, I don't feel as though the government really has a strategic vision or a sense of milestones and pathways. And all the way through that, of course, we've had the European Union to guide us, and also we've been part of the European Union, and that large trade committee, which is very knowledgeable, with members of the European Union, members of the European Parliament, MEPs, involved in understanding what are the human rights issues at stake here. Just to take another example, Iran. You know, it was Cathy Ashton, our own Cathy Ashton, when she was EU Commissioner, who led on the foreign policy work, which brought Iran to the table, where we could actually talk about stopping proliferation. And it was that, you know, large partnership of 550 million population, which is holding to account Iran, so that even when the US dropped out, we're still able to just keep that deal in place, hoping that, of course, when Biden comes on, we'll be able to look at it again. You know, regardless of what the most terrifying thing is, I mean, for many people in the labour movement, including myself, you know, the Israel-Palestine question, always having the European Union at the forefront of that. Now, I would hope that we'll just continue with that relationship, but this sort of bad faith which is developed now does make us very isolated in those conversations. The E3 is just hanging together, France, Germany, and the UK. But, you know, I really feel we've got to hang on to those relationships so that our wider foreign policy has more heft. It's very easy to ignore a country with just 66 million people compared to the EU with 500 million. And that's the kind of calculation that the government has not yet articulated, but which we in the labour movement could spend some thinking time while we are in opposition to lay out how we would do things differently. And obviously that would be having a much closer relationship with the European Union partners.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I think there's a conversation to be had there with the country, but I guess the trick is having it in a way which doesn't make people feel, you know, inferior, like we're no longer a great power, or that it's a very humbling experience for people, and do it in a way where it feels like closer engagement with the European Union and the advantages that come with that in terms of influence as well as in terms of economy, you know, is aspirational, and it's about creating that greater Britain that we all want to be part of, because people are rightly patriotic, and I think we all recognise that, and we all have that, you know. But that means that this conversation is therefore a complicated one, I suppose. I'm going to move on from Brexit, but I'm sure we'll come back to it when we come to questions from the audience, which we will do pretty soon. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things. So very quickly on Belarus, what's, as much as we can cover that quickly, what work have you been doing on that, and what is your awareness of what might be happening there and what we can hope for, and indeed what Labour can do through the conversations that you're having?
I mean, I think for every woman in the Labour movement who saw the leader of Belarus the day after the election didn't go his, well, we don't know the exact result of that election, do we? Because they didn't have any proper international observers. But to see Lukashenko with all dressed up in leather, with a gun over his shoulder to intimidate protesters, and to have the two main protesters, Svetlana and Maria, both standing up to him, I think it's very scary what is happening in Belarus, and also the stories that we've heard around people who have been intimidated, thrown into prison, beaten in prison. And I've been in touch with colleagues who know Belarus well, academics and diaspora members. The government hasn't been as forthcoming with diaspora members, hasn't yet worked on the sanctions regime, so we're pushing them in that regard to see whether they can put back sanctions on the elections, which previously the European Union had on Belarus. Obviously, the UK has got a financial interest because we are the second biggest foreign direct investor in Belarus, and I'm sure the government has an eye to that. With Brexit, you see how it can compromise our position so quickly. And I've certainly been in touch also with the Lithuanian ambassador and foreign minister, because I was keen to get a briefing on how Svetlana was keeping, how Maria was keeping, and it's been really difficult to sort of get that across to the degree that I wanted to. We've also been working with the International Trade Union Congress, the ITUC, so that we can partner with people in the workplace who are facing difficult times, because it's quite sensitive. Of course, some of that work has to be, done in a way that's not going to endanger anyone, because as the protests continue week after week, it's going to get much more dangerous for trade union members in factories, trade union members who work in workplaces where they've been very open about their concerns around the election, which was contested, and who want to support the leaders, the women leaders of the people's movement there. And we're continuing to work through our trade union partners there, and I will continue to bring it to Parliament. Those of you who are Parliament watchers will know that because we don't have the Westminster Hall debates, we haven't been able to have as much debating on Belarus as we wanted. We have managed to have Foreign Office questions where I asked about, the Foreign Office's capacity, because since 2010, the Foreign Office has cut back on its research functions in UK missions abroad around human rights, which means that we have fewer people on the ground who can provide information for the Foreign Office. And that's something which I feel is holding us back. We don't have a proper Belarus desk, and we don't have a Belarus speaker, to the best of my knowledge. So those sorts of questions I've been asking in written parliamentary questions, so we can really hold this government to account over its foreign policy.
Great, thank you. Just to say to attendees, we will come to your questions very soon. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll come to those. Couple of other things I wanted to cover. So firstly, Russia. Obviously, Russia's become increasingly belligerent over recent years. Is that one of your major concerns in terms of geopolitics as we come out of the European Union? And if so, what do you think the government should be doing in terms of our relationship with Russia? Perhaps particularly in light of the Navalny poisonings as well. But of course, that's not Russia's first misdemeanor, if you like.
I think we're increasingly aware of the aggression, particularly after the Salisbury poisonings. But the best tool that we have in the UK is our financial sector. So in today's news, you'd be aware that the Russian oligarch has donated money to the Tory party. And, we have got games of tennis with Boris Johnson and Theresa May meeting up with various people. And we must use our financial sector and we must monitor our financial sector in the way that they do in the US, to give Steve Mnuchin his due. And I wouldn't normally be praising one of Mr. Trump's sidekicks, but Steve Mnuchin has put in a more nimble sanctions arrangement so that there can be sanctions put on countries where there is corruption. And the Magnitsky sanctions, which were brought in, which eventually, when, you know, by next year, when we're no longer in the European Union transition period, we will have our own sanctions regime. Interestingly, the Tory government did not put in corruption. So where a corrupt individual is using, for example, the unexplained wealth orders, they've done 4 when they should have done 20. You know, that we are not using the power that we have at our fingertips, with London as a huge financial centre, to actually hold to account the money which is stolen from Russian, Belarusians, Ukrainians, from their previously publicly held assets, which then become companies, and oligarchs take that money and move it to the London property market, or through our banks, or through the Cayman Islands and the BVI. So I would really like to see, you know, much more effort being put in to this government using the powers which it has to hold dirty money to account.
And is our government currently doing any of that, or is it just ignoring it? Is that
well, following the important work which Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell did together as cross-party group, and bringing amendments to the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act in 2018, there has been a tightening of some of the provisions. However, you can see that when they had an opportunity with the sanctions statutory instrument, which came forward in the last week of term in July, already they've failed to put the corruption heading in. So, you know, even though on paper some effort has been made by backbench members to bring forward the date by which our own Crown dependencies and our own overseas territories, like the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, must open the books, as it were. That's 2023. You see, why can't we have that in 2021? 2 years more of just allowing these shell companies to develop. And these shell companies are basically going to allow people just to say, oh, I've got a new company called Catherine West Inc., and just set up a new shell company, put millions of pounds into it, not pay a penny of tax. And actually what it means for regimes like, you know, Russia, like the Ukrainian regime, Belarus, Azerbaijan, all those countries, is not paying no taxation, and none of that money going back to those people in those countries.
And it does just feel like the government turns a blind eye to it, doesn't it?
Definitely. And well, we can see from today's news that there's definitely links in with the Tory party funding. And is there also a rumour that Mr. Johnson went and had another weekend with Mr. Lebedev in Perugia?
That is the
For a start, how jolly for him when we're all back here, self-isolating and making sure we don't talk to our neighbours or anyone else and got masks on. But secondly, you know, what is that relationship with Mr. Lebedev, whose father, of course, was very high up in the KGB, and who are the connections? Who is he meeting when he's there? There's a lot of questions to be answered. And if you read Luke Harding's book, who's a fantastic Guardian journalist, he asks a lot of those difficult questions, and they are all linked into criminality, money, and nefarious activities by rogue Russian former KGB officers.
It feels like there's a lot that we don't know that's going on under the scenes. I haven't read that book though, but it sounds like I should. So we're going to come to audience questions in a minute, but before we do, I do want to touch on Northern Ireland, because I always feel like Northern Ireland is, you know, obviously one of the biggest repercussions of Brexit and one of the biggest stories of Brexit, and yet it gets so little airtime in national media. And so I think so many people, including a lot of politicians and a lot of people in the media, think that because the protocol is there, Northern Ireland is fine. And of course that isn't true. It wasn't true before the Internal Market Bill was published, and it's true even less now the Internal Market Bill has been published, which makes things far more complicated again for Northern Ireland. So what work are you currently doing on Northern Ireland, and what's your hope for how things progress over the next few weeks?
Yeah. So just rewinding to Boris Johnson's cocktail party in Northern Ireland during the general election, when he promised that there would be no paperwork to fill in and there'd be no difficulties at any border. Just come and see me if there's a problem. Just call me. You know, it'll be fine. Of course, then when the protocol came out, there was a lot of detail, and Hilary Benn has been very good on this with his Brexit subcommittee questions, but basically saying, you know, do you have to fill in these exit declaration forms, which of course, as people will know who are in this meeting because they take an interest in Europe, if you go down to your local supermarket and buy a block of cheddar, there's a great chance that it will have been originated in Northern Ireland because that's where the grass is the greenest and we have a lot of dairy enterprises there. It goes down over the border, it is then processed, comes back up to Northern Ireland, then across to the UK. So we're not talking about a small number of products here. In terms of the goods issue, which we know that there's services and goods, this is major in terms of our food supply. And so when the the Internal Market Bill came forward, Mr. Gove said it was tidying up loose ends, implying that perhaps he could try and resolve this issue about exit declaration forms and so on for Northern Ireland businesses. However, it's complicated it because it's meant that this then reverts to the border concept or the checking or the phytosanitary measures being introduced back in Newry and Armagh again. And when I visited Northern Ireland with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee last year, which Tom Tugendhat chairs, it was a very interesting visit because it wasn't, even though people voted largely to remain in the EU, it was actually some of the Brexiteers who said, if we hadn't had Brexit, you wouldn't be here now. And I thought that sounded a bit like the sort of regional concern, which is we want London to pay attention to us. But it was a very interesting visit to see you know, how complicated this arrangement is, regardless of what your actual view is, just at a very practical, pragmatic level, it is very complicated. And of course, in places like Newry, where really now the communities are integrated, when you speak to working people there, they say, we do not want to go back to the Troubles, and we do not want to return to a sense of conflict. We want to be integrated. And my feeling is the end game will be that Northern Ireland eventually, once some of the DUP perhaps get older and have fewer votes, because it's mainly an older people's party, we could end up with Northern Ireland not being part of the UK anymore at all and becoming part of United Ireland. So if we lost Scotland and Northern Ireland, I think that really is sort of where this thinking and this political energy is pushing us. I don't think it's stated. I don't think at any level people want that, but the implication of this sort of government and the dominance of strong, hard Brexiteers in it is to push away the regions. And those of you who have watched Parliament last week, you will have seen how angry some of the Welsh MPs were, for example, because the Internal Market Bill assumes that there's nothing different about Wales. We're all just the same. We've only got one internal market, haven't we? And it erases all those issues around difference, which I think when we were in government a long time ago now, 10 years ago and before, you know, it was Labour who introduced the devolved governments because we recognise difference. And I think it's deeply problematic the way that this Internal Market Bill is heading, because it will end up with just the regions and London. But nobody's talked about it for a little while, but, you know, what's to say that London will remain part of the UK? As a London MP, lots of London people are very, very frustrated in the current climate. Strong Remainers want to be part of the bigger picture and do feel quite held back. And so, you know, for the sake of unity, I think the government should not be pursuing this Internal Market Bill, and it should be trying to work with Europe, get a good deal, as good as it can at this point, so that we can go forward, keep things broadly the same in terms of our food supply and our relationships, and then get working on the really dangerous issues around China, Russia, what's happening with the US, because of course that's a very big factor in any of our foreign policy, which way the US will go next.
I agree with you, and I mean, just as you say all that, it just, and you compare that to how our government behaves, it just feels like we don't have a serious government that is engaging with, you know, national issues, of course, like handling the pandemic, but also things like difference and like the regions and like Scotland and Northern Ireland and so on, and then geopolitically as well. Just they're just behaving like children, basically, aren't they? And that's a bit of an insult to children, actually. But I just mean that they're not taking it seriously. Right, we will, in the last 6 minutes, we will come to questions from the audience. And sorry to be getting to these a little bit late. But thank you for all of that, Catherine. That was fascinating. So first question from an anonymous attendee is, what kind of resolution do you want to see on fishing and level playing field? Do you think the government should agree to the EU's asks in order to protect trade and Northern Ireland?
I think on fishing, there is room for a little bit of movement on our side. The reason I say that is that fishing as an industry is worth £1 billion. Fashion in the UK is worth 35 billion. So I just think we need to see it as an industry that will grow. We will get many more rights. We will probably enter the annual negotiation in the way that Norway and other countries do. And I think that we can show a little bit of flexibility in return, perhaps, for asking for more freedoms around the level playing field. The reason I think the level playing field is a bit of a red herring is because if you look at the actions of this government since the coronavirus came, that has been state aid on steroids. We have had intervention in our railways. We have had interventions straight into our pockets through the job retention scheme. We've had government-backed loans for companies. I could not imagine John McDonnell doing anything more radical than what Rishi Sunak has done. I really think the only thing that Labour would have done differently, and Annalise has been very good on this, our Shadow Chancellor, is we would have had a much more sector-specific and agile system. So I think, for example, in aviation, we've come in quite late, and I think a lot of jobs there are really, really at risk now. So that I think we could have done something much more refined, and I would hope that we wouldn't have wasted 3.5 billion, which this government appears to just consider to be a bit of wastage. But that's why I feel this idea that we can't intervene or that we can't act within our own economy, it really is just another way of blaming the EU for our own lives. And if we'd done a little bit more of this in 2010, we might not have had Brexit, because I do feel that Brexit and austerity are very closely linked, because people have felt desperate and they have thought there's something big that's got to change. We have to do something really enormous to make our region or our lives better. And because of the way that the EU is used as a bit of a bogeyman in some of our press, I think it was easy to say if we could just leave the EU, we'd have a stronger sense of sovereignty.
Yeah,
I feel that they're very closely linked, and I'm sure historians will link them closely if you look at the timing.
I agree hardly. I think Brexit was the wrong answer to the right question. The right question being something has to change. And unfortunately, the change they were offered was Brexit, and it's completely the wrong change. It's not the change that we need at all. So next question, which is about EHIC and people with pre-existing conditions. Has Labour raised this issue? Because, of course, the loss of the EHIC card come next January, will mean that it will be very difficult and or impossible for people with disabilities or pre-existing conditions to travel. Has Labour raised this issue, and has the government got a response to it?
Well, Labour's raised it, but as with a number of things, the government says, oh, this will be resolved when the negotiations are in full flow. But it is time for me to put in another written question. So if my questioner could please pop me a little email just reminding me, I will put that in, because obviously as the Shadow Europe Minister, I work closely with Rachel Reeves, who leads on the questioning of Michael Gove on the negotiation and the protocol. And also with Ed Miliband's team on the internal market bill. So we're doing a sort of a joint action, but specifically, I would like to know the answer to that question as well. So if you pop that into me, and also for any questioners who don't get to ask a question today, please put it in, particularly those factual ones where I can try and push the government harder.
Great. That's a good idea. So that was from Elizabeth Goodburn. So Elizabeth, if you can email Catherine, that would be great. So next question from an anonymous attendee. Do you want the UK to be in a customs union with the European Union?
Well, I certainly voted in Parliament to keep the customs union in the single market. I think that ship has probably sailed in terms of where we're at now. I always felt that the customs union was the easier one, because it's what we know, what we see, it's the ferries, it's the trains, it's the haulage companies. However, I think where we're at now, who knows what is going to happen. We could end up genuinely with masses of problems at the ports. My instinct is, given that COVID is getting set to be worse again, and that we've had a 20% reduction in Q2 of this year of our economy, which makes it the worst recession since after the First World War, and given that we've got this massive challenge on climate change, I would be surprised if the government rushed headlong into a no-deal Brexit. However, I've said that before. I've said they couldn't possibly do this or that, and it's happened. So, I'm just very wary when a government is this ideologically driven, and when, for them, Brexit, regardless of what sort of Brexit that is, seems to be the overriding factor, which is why we're saying get Brexit done, meaning get a good deal. And also we're trying to keep Boris Johnson to his promise that it was an oven-ready deal. It was all you had to do was cook it. Everything was ready to go. And of course, that's where we're really trying to push them now, because we really, really do not want to have a no-deal Brexit. Forget about the EHIC card or any of those other things. If we have a no-deal Brexit, that sort of thing will just, we would really struggle to renegotiate all of those things after a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. So next question, and the answer may be that the ship has sailed on this one as well, is very sensibly from Dora saying, look, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Should we be calling for a lengthy pause on the Brexit negotiations so we can deal with the virus first and then come to deal with Brexit later?
I think realistically speaking, with this Parliament and the MPs who I've seen in this Parliament, and I don't know if any of you saw the Daily Mail coverage of one of the MPs who says he's refusing to do the unconscious bias training. He just doesn't think that this applies to him. This is a week after Charlie Elphicke, a former colleague of his, was, given a jail sentence for sexual abuse related to parliamentary duties. No problem there. But this is the sort of MP that we're dealing with. And the idea that the Tories would take those MPs through the lobbies to vote for pausing Brexit is just not realistic, which is why we've tried to focus on, the facts, what Brexit means for you, what a no deal means for you, rather than a parliamentary procedure which we feel, would entrap us back into all those all those wounds which are not quite healed yet. We want to be pragmatic and try and push them on what they've actually promised, which is this oven-ready deal. And we want to see that this oven-ready deal goes through, and that we do actually end up with a deal with the European Union.
I agree. That's the priority now. We just have to hope. We just have to hope that's where we end up. Next question from Nigel. Will trade with the rest of the world compensate for Brexit? Has he missed something?
I mean, who knows what's going to happen in 30 years' time? I mean, it could be that in 30 years' time, we are able to, get ourselves back to being highly sort of competitive and fair, which seems to me quite difficult to do. I think if a US trade deal is going to be successful, then there are a lot of issues to iron out, because as you're all aware, after the European Union, the EU is our next biggest trading partner, because, for example, we haven't ironed out the agricultural element of that trade deal. We haven't ironed out the pharmaceutical element of that, because when we say hands off our NHS in a trade deal with the US, it's not really the services side, because unfortunately the Tory government in 2012, or the coalition, introduced any willing provider, which means there's already American healthcare companies providing services in the UK. They could expand that, of course, but what they really want is access to our data, because the NHS system is one of the most integrated large databases of health of any population group in the world. The NHS holds data on a huge population, 66 million people, and it's a wonderful research tool. And of course, at the moment, the NHS owns that, and that's why we have different research projects which are run through collaborations and so on, but the data does belong to the NHS. And for pharmaceutical companies, this is very, very valuable. And I think a US trade deal will try and pick away at that and try and gain access. so that it can also then model medication and sell more medicine to us at a more expensive price. So there is a whole lot of things which will take, I think, 5 to 7 years to negotiate. So, for the best part of a decade, depending also on how the WTO is going to function and how functional it is, because of course currently it hasn't got the required number of officials at the top of it to run it. But I would imagine that for the next decade, we're going to actually lose momentum on much of our trade. And depending on how we leave things with the European Union, that could be really quite detrimental to, we know that we've already lost billions in our economy because of Brexit. And there was an announcement last week that some of the major banks are going to reposition themselves in Frankfurt in Germany because it's just too uncertain now. So, we will lose a lot of GDP. As we all know, GDP is only one measure or one metric for the economy. The real economy depends on many other things. There may be opportunities, for example, in manufacturing, which is only 10% of our economy. Even if that doubled in the next decade, let's say, and went to 20% of our economy because our pound is dropping, which is good for manufacturing, then perhaps there might be a bit more growth there, and that might actually be something good for the regions, which I think is something to look at. But I can't see us necessarily speeding ahead, in the next decade. But I can perhaps see after that we may be able to, we may be able to be more nimble than within the EU at that point. But most politicians think about the next 10 years because that's when I'm going to be an MP. That's when most people in Parliament are going to be MPs, and also a lost decade of growth for people who are, between the age of 15 and 25 now. We're talking about just throwing lives away, because if we have that loss of growth in the economy, which potentially might happen as a result of a no-deal Brexit, there are a lot of people who will be affected by that.
And that's on top of a lost decade of growth already. I mean, the Tories have done an incredibly bad job of running the economy for 10 years.
Exactly.
Which doesn't really get reported in the press, but it's true.
Yeah.
Right, one final question, and then we're going to go, because we're over time, I'm afraid. Sorry, everybody. From Mark Wiley, who is a British citizen living in Germany. He's worried that, and understandably, that the withdrawal agreement might just get trashed entirely because our government might walk out of it. If that happens, what would happen to citizens' rights protections in the withdrawal agreement, which are already not perfect?
Yeah, I mean, my reading at the moment is that citizens' rights is not being opened up again. However, as I said earlier on in this session, due to the unpredictable nature of this government, and, it is more similar in some ways to a sort of a Trump style of government in terms of not being able to predict what their next move will be, do stay close to us as Labour MPs. We can always find out what the answer to questions is. The big thing that I think is lost for people in your situation is that ability to move within Europe quickly. So as a British passport holder previously, people could move from Poland, where they maybe, let's say they're an engineer, 6 months there, 6 months in Italy, do a master's course in Germany. Whereas all that was possible, that of course now becomes much more difficult because every country will have slightly different arrangements. I'm in touch with the 3 million group here, of course, EU nationals, but I'm also in touch with the sort of umbrella group for British nationals who live in other European countries. So I've had a very helpful phone call with them in the last month, but please keep in touch with them. And if you email me, I can link you in with them, because I think it's very important to be in one of those umbrella groups right now while there's so much uncertainty. And also send me some ideas, send me some parliamentary questions and I'll put them in.
Great. Right, we are over time. So thank you, Catherine, so much for that. And thank you, everybody, for attending. This recording will get put online at some point in the next few days. So look out for that if you want to watch this back. And have a great rest of conference. And Catherine, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
I learned a lot from talking to you, and I know everybody else would have done as well.
Thanks, Mike. All the best.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Again. Thanks, Catherine. Bye-bye.